Hello, hello, hello. This week, I chose to do something a little off, the beaten path of mental illness and emotional response. It does still kind of tie into the basis for understanding cognition and emotional response and why we do the things that we do and enjoy the things that we do. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoy. So, what is ego? And what is id? They control what you do, done, did. I cannot even begin to comprehend the ego in the way the greats have, but it has always been a consistent subject in religious teachings and even in psychology, thanks to Sigmund Freud and many other self-proclaimed masters of the mind. So, what do they do exactly? They actually work in tandem to help create the person that you are and the behaviors that you have. And they're kind of like the little devil and the little angel on your shoulders during your decision making. Id being the little devil, and superego being the little angel. Do you guys remember watching Tom and Jerry as a kid? And you'd see those little decision making scenes with, So that's it. Basically, and what's in the middle? That's the ego. And that's usually where we identify ourselves as. They're all kind of abstract parts of how we identify and protect ourselves. I'm going to share with you guys something from verywellmind.com. And this is basically going to be a closer look at the ego. So the ego prevents us from acting on our basic urges, which are created by the id. But they also work to achieve, a balance with our moral and idealistic standards that's created by the superego. So while the ego operates in both the preconscious and the conscious, its strong ties to the id means that it operates also in the unconscious. So this information was actually collected by verywellmind.com. What we're going to do is we're going to take a closer look at the ego. So the ego prevents us from acting on our basic urges, which are created by the id, but they also help to achieve a balance with our moral and idealistic standards created by the superego. So while the ego operates in both the preconscious and the conscious, its strong ties to the id means that it also operates in the unconscious. And what is the unconscious? The ego operates based on the reality principle, which I'll elaborate on later. But this works to satisfy the id's desires in a manner that is realistic and socially acceptable. For example, let's say if someone cuts you off in traffic and the ego prevents you from chasing down the car and physically attacking the offending driver. The ego allows us to see that this response would be socially unacceptable. But it also allows us to know that there are other more appropriate means of venting our frustration. And to kind of build on this a little bit more, there was some information about Freud's observation on the ego. In his book in 1933, New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, Freud compared the relationship between the id and the ego to that of a horse and a rider. The horse represents the id, a powerful force that offers the energy to propel forward motion. The rider represents the ego, the guiding force that directs the power of the id towards a goal. So Freud also noted, however, that this relationship did not always go as planned. And in less ideal situations, a rider may find himself simply along for the ride, as he allows his horse to go in the direction that the animal wants to go. While we cannot observe the defenses in action, Anna Freud suggested that they could be observed in retrospect. Repression is one example. When something is repressed from awareness, the ego is not aware that the information is missing. It is only later when it becomes obvious that some piece of information or memory is gone, that the actions of the ego become apparent. Just as a rider may not always be able to control a horse, the id's primal urges may sometimes be too powerful for the ego to keep it in check. So what does this all mean? It means we're carnal creatures with consciousness. If we were to lose our consciousness, we would be no different from animals in the animal kingdom. In humans, consciousness has been defined as sentience, awareness, subjectivity, qualia. the ability to experience or feel wakefulness, and even having a sense of selfhood and the executive control of the mind. To save you guys a Google search, because I also had to do it, qualia is it's the subjective or qualitative properties of experiences, kind of like what it feels like experimentally to see a red rose differently from what it feels like to see a yellow rose. So next I'm going to move on to the origins of the ego. So Sigmund Freud said this in 1923, and this was in his book, The Ego and the Id. It is easy to see that the ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. And to move on to the ego's influence, the ego is not the master in its own house. The ego represents what we call reason and sanity in contrast to the id, which contains the passions. The poor ego has a harder time of it. It has to serve three harsh masters, and it has to do its best to reconcile the claims and demands of all three. The three tyrants are the external world, the superego, and the id. Towards the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly, an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if that were a fact. Now, the way the ego works, it filters all of our primal needs and desires through rational steps to achieve what we believe is right. What's the right course of action to obtain the things we desire? This is accomplished through what Freud called the reality principle. And the reality principle at work, to really understand the reality principle, it's important to first have a grasp of how the two components of personality identified by Freud function. The id seeks instant gratification of needs, demands, and urges. If we acted according to what our id wanted, we might find ourselves grabbing food off of another person's plate, or because it just kind of looks delicious, or getting too friendly with someone else's spouse when we're feeling amorous. The id is ruled by the pleasure principle, the idea that impulses need to be fulfilled immediately. Now, the ego, on the other hand, is the component of personality that deals with the demands of reality. It makes sure that the desires of the id are satisfied in ways that are effective and appropriate. In other words, the ego is ruled by the reality principle. So the reality principle forces us to consider the risks, requirements, and possible outcomes as we make decisions, by temporarily halting the discharge of the id's energy until a suitable time and place. In other words, the ego doesn't try to block an urge, but instead it works to make certain that the desires of the id are met in a way that is safe, realistic, and appropriate. For example, rather than snatching that slice of pizza, the ego will force you to wait until you can buy your own pizza. A delayed achievement through what is known as the secondary process. So often the ego is weak relative to the headstrong id. And the best that the ego can do is stay on, painting the id in the right direction and claiming some credit at the end as if it was his own actions. Now, if the ego fails in an attempt to use the reality principle, and anxiety is experienced, unconscious defense mechanisms are employed to help ward off unpleasant feelings like anxiety, to make good things feel better for the individual. So the ego engages in a secondary process. It's a secondary process of thinking which is rational and realistic and oriented towards problem solving. If a plan of action does not work, then it is thought through again until a solution is found. Now, this is known as reality testing, and it enables the person to control their impulses and demonstrate self-control via mastery of the ego. Now, an important feature of clinical and social work is to enhance ego functioning and help the client really test reality through assisting the client through thinking through their options. The ego engages in a couple different things, but moving on to the superego here. So the superego kind of consists of two systems, the conscious and the ideal self. So the conscience can punish the ego through causing feelings of guilt. For example, if the ego gives in to the id's demands, the superego may make the person feel bad through guilt. So the ideal self, or ego ideal, is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be and represents career aspirations, how to treat other people, and how to behave as a member of society. So when behavior falls short of the ideal self, we may be punished by the superego through guilt. The superego can also reward us through the ideal self when we behave properly by making us feel proud. If a person's ideal self is too high a standard, then whatever the person does will represent failure. The ideal self and conscience are largely determined in childhood from parental values and how you were brought up. And so to move on to the ego a little bit more, I'm going to talk about ego strength. And a strong ego is exhibited in the following characteristics of objectivity in one's apprehension of the external world and in self-knowledge. The capacity to organize activities over long time spans, for allowing for the maintenance of schedules and plans, and the ability to follow results while choosing decisively among alternatives. The person of strong ego can also resist immediate environmental and social pressure while contemplating and choosing an appropriate course. And a strong ego is further characterized in the person who is not overwhelmed by his or her drives, but instead can direct them in useful channels. On the other hand, weakness of ego is characterized by such traits as impulsivity or immediate behavior, a sense of inferiority or an inferiority complex, a fragile sense of identity, unstable emotionality, and excessive vulnerability. So with the perception of reality and self, they can be distorted in this instance. And in such cases, the individual may be less capable of productive work because energy is drained into the protection of unrealistic self-concepts. Or the individual may be burdened by neurotic symptoms. Ego weakness can also have underlying inflated sense of self, which can be associated with grandiosity and a superiority complex. And this was shared by Britannica.com. While Freud's studies have been a benchmark for the studies of modern psychoanalysis and therapy methods, they have pretty much been disproven to an extent. It's been stated that Freud relied too much on ambiguities for his data and using dreams and free association to come up with his conclusions. And really, without empirical data, many of his theories were pretty weak and ultimately failed standards for treatment. And I'm going to move on to some criticisms of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. So one of the largest criticisms of his psychoanalytical theory is that it places far too much emphasis on childhood. For one, Freud's theory says that personality development occurs during childhood, but many modern psychologists say that this development is lifelong. A similar criticism is that the minds of children do not attain as much trauma that Freud linked many psychological illnesses to. Also, criticisms have been raised against Freudian slips, saying they do not arise from unconscious motives, but rather confusion in word retrieval and from memory. So, also, Freud's ideas of repression are rebuked by most modern psychologists who say repression is a rare phenomenon and that intense stress and pain actually causes better remembrance of an event. One other criticism of his theory was directed on his idea of the unconscious mind. Critics stated that the unconscious mind did not consist of hidden or repressed passionate emotions. Instead, it was underlying information such as cognition, memory, perception, as well as emotion, but generally not the repressed kind. And That information was provided by Myers-D back in 2010, Psychology and Modules in Personality. So, guys, I know this has been a lot. This is all abstract, and while conceptual, this has been the basis of a lot of research toward understanding mental illness, personality disorders, sociopathic and psychopathic behaviors. While there's a lot of criticism towards the man Sigmund Freud and his understanding of the ego and the it, it has been crucial moving forward. Again, I'm not specialized in psychology, psychoanalysis, or any parts of the mind. This is honestly all from a week's worth of research. Don't take this as a literal fact, as this information is almost 100 years old, and science has come a long way from women being witches, and schizophrenia was possession that could only be cured by exorcisms and leeching. But guys, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. As always, it's been a pleasure to share this with you, and I hope I was able to pique your interest in the matters of the mind. Thank you for being a part of my process, and I hope to be a part of yours. You are loved, you have value, and you're worthy of happiness. I'm here today because I hope to see you tomorrow. Please like and subscribe. Maybe share this with someone who's interested in learning more about the ego. Understanding ourselves and our behaviors is the only way to get in front of it. Have a great week, guys. I'll see you next time.